Often when we think about being in our integrity, we think about speaking our truth and living in accordance with our highest principles. We think integrity requires that we know what's right and that we do what's right. There can, of course, be a lot of truth in this, especially when our truth is based on principles of fairness, equality, and compassion. But sometimes in our attempts to be honest, to speak our truth, and to do the right thing, we forget to be kind. We forget that most people come to be who they are honestly. We forget that much of the time behind the behavior and attitudes that we can find so difficult to understand and deal with in other people is actually a good amount of suffering, ignorance, and fear. So for those of us who've spent a good chunk of our lives trying to understand the human species and the world around us, it can be particularly difficult to admit that we don't have a corner on truth. And no matter how much our own perceptions, principles, and values make sense to us, they also reflect the sum total of our life experience, the blessings that stem from our privilege, and the limitations that come from our conditioning. Just like the people who act in ways that drive us absolutely crazy are so hard for us to understand, we also carry our unique brand of wounding. We live at the mercy of our own fears, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And no matter how much we've learned or think we know, no matter how subtle, seemingly small, or unintentional or unkind transgressions might be, we can be just as guilty of acting out of our own ignorance. So if you're drawn to this course, I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes you forget to be kind to yourself. Many people who have the deep desire to make a positive difference in the world live with the burden of standards that are so high. We live with this constant nagging feeling that we're not doing enough, that we're not doing it right, that we're failing to live up to our ideals. Our attempts to be and act from a place of integrity can lead to self-criticism. Remember how in the beginning of this course I spoke of the dictionary definitions of integrity. One part of the definition had to do with living in accordance with a moral code. The other part had to do with achieving a state of wholeness, of integrating, embracing all of our parts, even those parts that aren't anywhere near perfect. So, what does this mean? It means that when it comes to loving kindness, when it comes to becoming whole in relation to this aspect of integrity, we need to practice kindness towards ourselves too. It also means that we need to stay awake to the inner critic, because very few of us can be kind to everybody all of the time. Even fewer of us can be kind to ourselves all of the time, especially these days when many of us are living in a completely emotionally overwhelming world, when every time we turn on the television or check out our smartphones or walk out the door, it's like walking right up to a fear buffet. And this is why when I think of loving kindness, I think of a resilient heart. Not a heart that's always open, but a heart that has thoroughly practiced the art of opening back up after understandable and frequent moments of constriction. So it's in the spirit of a resilient heart that I now call upon the wisdom keeper who's going to sit in the collective seat of loving kindness. Let's see who comes to us. The wisdom keeper I pulled on behalf of the collective, the wisdom keeper who's going to be sitting in the seat of loving kindness over the coming days and weeks, is the wisdom keeper of equality and tenderness. This is a profound card. And the more I feel into it, the more I feel it speaks straight to the heart of cultivating a resilient heart in the face of tremendous inner and outer resistance. So let me start by sharing the story of this wisdom keeper with you and then their gift to you. And after that, I'll share some reflections that came up for me in relation to this particular wisdom keeper and some ways for you to explore your own response to the collective integrity themes that are inherent in this story. And as I read from the inner guidebook, feel free to listen with eyes opened or closed. It's totally up to you. From the point of view of the human heart, all humanity is one family. By Richard Rudd. Though I was born into a girl's body, I always felt like a boy deep down. My family was conventional. My father worked, my mother took care of the children and was completely dependent on him financially. He often treated her disrespectfully and with cruelty, as if she were weak, overly sentimental, and only nice to look at. As I got older, I saw men like him ruling the world, so I rejected my father, the patriarchy, as well as the boy in me. In absolute solidarity with my mother, I would be a girl, no matter how painful or wrong it felt within. Without realizing it, I spent the following years using every masculine muscle I had to idealize and fight for all things feminine. I envisioned and worked for a world where women were the leaders. I became an activist and speaker, empowering women worldwide with my ideals. I also became financially independent and bartered with the big boys for rights and privileges on behalf of women everywhere. Privately, though, I was an emotional wreck. I alienated my romantic partners constantly with unfair and cruel accusations and an insatiable need for emotional processing. The truth was that deep down, I was fighting for one thing: acceptance. But I couldn't even give that to myself. I was too weak to share, much less own, how I felt inside or how I wanted to live my life. I had zero trust that my romantic partners would still love me as a man, nor trust that the world would ever accept a freak like me. I was convinced that if my feminist community discovered how I really felt inside, they'd no longer see me as a leader, but as an outsider, maybe even an enemy. When the pain of hiding from myself was too great, I decided to drive to a transgender support group in a town where I'd never be recognized. I sat in the back of the room and just listened. My own story was told over and over again by different people. Because of their courage, I found myself, my pain, longing, loneliness, and overwhelming fear. At the end of the meeting, someone came up to me, and to my shock, it was someone I knew. I expected an attack, but instead, I was given the most tender embrace. In that moment, I knew I'd find my way back to me, and that I wouldn't have to do it alone. See if you can feel the tenderness in this wisdom keeper's words. See if you can allow this tenderness to soften your shoulders, your breath, your body as you listen. I am your friend. I have deep respect for you. I don't want you to change who you are at your core. You are a completely unique, worthy being, and there is a place for you in this world of ours. I see you with deep tenderness. It is time to take your place with pride, humility, and profound self-acceptance. When you look at yourself, see your weakness and vulnerability as your strengths. When you look out at the world, see beyond polarities, beyond gender stereotypes, beyond patriarchy and matriarchy. Aim your eye towards synthesis, to the entire continuum of beauty available to all of us. Equality is your birthright. You and me, we are family. You and me, we are family. Just take that in. We are family. No matter how differently we look, no matter how differently we think, feel, identify, or express that identity, no matter how differently we believe, or act, or seem, we are family. We are each essential parts of a grand whole, and each of our inner parts make us the whole of who we are. So this wisdom keeper of equality and tenderness has come to teach all of us something about being whole and undivided, both as a human family that has come together in unity, where all members are accepted and embraced as worthy beings, and as individual human beings, where all of our parts are welcome, where all aspects of ourself, even those parts we find it hardest to love, are here to be listened to and ultimately embraced. I'm reminded of Rumi's Guest House. You've probably heard that poem before, but I want to share just a little passage from it so that we can all breathe it in the context of this particular wisdom keeper who's come to teach us something important about loving kindness and what it requires of us. The guest house. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. At first, when I drew this card for this course, I felt a little nervous. This Wisdom Keeper story touches on a deeply charged subject in our world today, right? One that's been at the heart of so much pain and fear, one that has instigated so much violence and been used to drive wedges between people and families at work and religious communities and political communities and government and societies all over the world. Even people who would normally consider themselves to be open-minded and progressive have gotten lost in the manifestations of divisiveness that are depicted in this complex and layered story. In a way, it feels perfect that it is a transgendered wisdom keeper who's come to help us explore the many ways in which we can be swept up in a tidal wave of collective division. It is so easy to lose touch with our potential for becoming whole people inside of a diverse yet whole humanity. And in so many of our childhood homes and early relationships, centuries of gender oppression, competition, conditioning, and wounding have played themselves out. Multi-generational seeds of division are planted between grandparents, between parents, and between siblings before we even learn to speak, right? So in our communities, unacknowledged and unhealed ancestral and cultural wounding spread endless forms of conflict. And I'm not only talking about ultra-conservative or fundamentalist communities here where one might expect strong and harsh biases against women or certain marginalized groups of people. I'm talking about the kind of division that can show up in communities where you wouldn't even expect it, in progressive, spiritual communities, where members pride themselves in being open-minded, compassionate, willing to stand up for the rights of marginalized people, or important yet neglected causes. So instead of looking for common ground and joining forces, too many members of oppressed groups or advocates for important causes end up getting lost in identity politics or clinging tightly to their particular approaches to social spiritual change. And instead of forming alliances and strengthening our human family and our shared planet, we end up turning against each other in a competition for empathy, for attention, validation, and justice. We end up in a really big, messy fight for peace. The way that many transgendered people have been and still are treated around the world shows us just how extreme and destructive a viscerally, culturally, and politically inflamed prejudice against a group of human beings can be. This Wisdom Keeper story also shows how an outer experience of discrimination or oppression can lead to a very painful internalized sense of self-loathing. The transgendered movement has become one of the most politically charged subjects in recent years. There are so many perspectives on it, from one extreme to the other. So you've got people who blame the phenomenon on too much fluoride in the water, on some secret Illuminati plot to control the population or manipulate public opinion. Some people believe that the transgender issue and political correctness policing are being used intentionally by conservative religious and political groups in order to infiltrate, create divisions within, and ultimately weaken progressive movements. Some believe this is another example of a manufactured culture war here to provide people with a mass distraction so that we're so caught up in identity politics that we won't notice what the government and what governmental policies are actually doing to the environment, what proxy wars are being fought in our name, and how many innocent people are actually being killed on behalf of the self-interest of the 0.001%. Then there are those who remind us that transgendered people have not always been around, but they've actually been revered in many indigenous cultures all over the world. Before they were pushed into the closet, they were seen and honored as spiritual teachers and medicinal healers. Many evolutionary thinkers believe that transgenderism, gender fluidity, androgyny, and the growing rainbow of human expression that seems to be emerging around the globe are actually signs of our shared evolution. They believe that we're all moving towards greater freedom, authenticity, wholeness, and fluidity, where the human spirit can come to its fullest expression and where individuals can allow their true authentic natures to emerge without having to carry generations and generations of heavy constricting conditioning on their backs. So people like this Wisdom Keeper are simply pointing us in this colorful, permission-giving direction where we're all headed. However you happen to look at transgenderism, and wherever you fall on the gender identity expression or orientation continuum, I'd like you to look at the ways in which you can relate to this wisdom keeper, this human being. Your story might be extremely different on the surface, but I bet underneath you'll be able to find some parallels, because this is a human story, an archetypal hero's journey kind of story, where someone is learning how to embrace themselves lovingly so that they can be themselves fully in the world and make their unique contribution. In order for them to do that, they need to be received with loving kindness, with tenderness, by someone somewhere. Only kindness, only being seen and received as part of a loving human family has the power to help them begin to open their heart up to themselves and begin their true life, where they're no longer hiding in a closet or rejecting some essential part of themselves. That's most of us right there. That's most of us. This wisdom keeper is offering you a chance to look at those parts of yourself that have been forced into and or have found a home in the closet. Those parts that for whatever reason have been forbidden, charged, controversial, or just plain unsafe to acknowledge, embrace, or express. Now, your story is your story. Only you know what your conditioning has been throughout your life, as a young child, as a teenager, as a young adult, as a mature adult. Only you know what has been forced to live its days in the closet. It might be your sexuality. It might be your anger. It might be your irreverent humor. It might be, one of your most shame-inducing insecurities. It might be a traumatic experience that you've never talked about. It might be your spiritual views. It might be your political leanings. It might be the fact that you're totally into super weird paranormal phenomena like me. My guess is that some of your passionate, talented, glorious light has also been hiding in the closet, if not now, then at some point in your past. Now, one thing I've found, and you might relate to this, is that things aren't so clear-cut. Certain aspects of yourself may feel safe to express in one environment or community, but then not so safe in others. And if you're like me, you may have a pretty big range of possible expressions. So some people, for example, know me as a super social being. Others know me as a total introvert. A few people know me, really well, know me as an absolute goofball. One of my cousins once described me as a very serious person who almost never speaks. And I bet that's not your impression of me right now. I can hardly shut up. So anyway, this is why you'll rarely find me happily throwing big birthday parties for myself, where all of the different people that I know from all walks of life gathered together in one place. Anyway, so it makes sense that each of us has a very unique, often winding, confusing, and chopped up path towards finding and expressing our true nature. So here's another example from my life. One of the most painful and confusing true nature struggles I experienced was when I was in the process of making a decision about how I wanted to give birth to my daughter. Now, my parents were very caring, responsible people who'd grown up with largely mainstream values. My dad was a traditional pediatrician, and even though my mom insisted on not receiving pain medication during the delivery of both of her daughters, which was actually a big deal at the time, both of my parents felt extremely strongly that I should give birth in a hospital. Anything else to them was not only scary, but a deeply irresponsible thing to do. Making a choice like that to them was the equivalent of like putting my baby and myself in harm's way. It would almost be like unforgivable. And then on the other hand, I had spent 8 years of my life working within a highly alternative community where the ideal birth experience was supposed to take place in the ocean and end with an orgasm. Or at least it would happen at home in a hot tub and require no medication. So to this particular community, the spiritual community, birth was supposed to be a natural process, something to be trusted and surrendered to. Sometimes hospitals were needed, but those were rare cases. Most often, hospitals were guilty of treating pregnancy like an illness and initiating a cascade of interventions that could lead to all kinds of complications that would ultimately or could ultimately be harmful to both mother and baby. So in this environment, intentionally choosing a hospital birth and pain medication was seen as the deeply irresponsible thing to do. Oh my God, it took me a really long time to cut through these two potent streams of opposing conditioning and find the approach that was right for me. The approach which would necessarily include the humbling realization that I, and most birthing mothers learn at some point, ultimately had very little control over how my baby was going to be born. I could certainly set my intentions and provide the best possible conditions to support those intentions, but then I'd have to let go and surrender. My daughter's birth, of course, was not the first or last time or the only life arena where I've had to learn that very humbling lesson. My point in sharing this personal story with you is to show how we can feel pulled, prodded, and shoved in so many directions depending on where we come from, who's around us, and what we're trying to accomplish, including survive. It's not easy to be a multifaceted human being trying to navigate our way through a pretty crazy world when so much is at stake. When we might be thrown out of the proverbial tribe for being or expressing who we are. Or worse, this is probably also why I was so attracted to human design all of those years ago, which is essentially an authenticity practice, and why I was ultimately led to the Gene Keys by Richard Rudd, which, if boiled down to its essence, is a kindness practice in the face of our personal and collective shadows. This is also why I ended up creating the Wisdom Keepers with their uniquely human stories and their loving, accepting gazes. Now, one of the most important gifts the Wisdom Keepers were meant to bring us doesn't involve words at all. It's simply their ability to receive us lovingly into their hearts, to give us a feeling that we're okay, just as we are, no matter what. And then, of course, there's the 65th card, which is a mirror card, offering each of us a chance to quite literally look upon ourselves with loving kindness. So all of this is just to say how happy I am that the Wisdom Keeper of Equality and Tenderness came to us and will be an Integrity Council member, sitting in the collective seat of loving kindness. So I'm going to place this Wisdom Keeper in this collective seat of loving kindness on behalf of all of us. And you're welcome to do the same now if you'd like, or if you'd prefer, you could keep this Wisdom Keeper inside of your deck in case you serendipitously choose it when it's your turn to choose a Wisdom Keeper for your personal Wheel of Integrity. And that's totally fine too. It's up to you. So whether you've placed this card on your personal wheel or not, let's take a look at it together. When we look at this Wisdom Keeper, let's be reminded of how much all of us as a collective need each other to mirror back to us our innate lovability, our deep down innocence, our goodness. We need to practice tenderness. Let's remember that if humanity is going to develop integrity together, oh my God, we're just going to have to be a little more kind. If we're to uncover what true equality looks and feels like, we're going to need to be tender with each other. Don't get me wrong here. We don't have to agree with everybody. We don't have to relate to everybody or be passive doormats. We don't have to work with everyone, live with everyone, or become friends with everybody. But we don't have to be so mean. Okay, so let me give you an example here. Over these past years, as our world has become increasingly crazy, and our mainstream news has become more of an entertainment channel than a place for investigative journalism to flourish, I found myself looking to today's comedians for commentary on world events. And a lot of the time, the laughter and relief that I feel watching them as the comedians call out hypocrisy and acknowledge important truths with wit, sensitivity, and insightful satire is like a healing balm to my soul. One thing I love about my favorite comedians is that they're not afraid of admitting to their own imperfections. It's their raw authenticity and their willingness to lay bare their utter humanity that gives them credibility in my eyes. I'm not saying that no comedians are in the business of hiding some supersized weaknesses, but I do believe that on the whole, the self-berating comedic profession has a better chance of producing people of integrity than the conventional political realm, where politicians, in order to survive, are forced to project an image of absolute perfection going back to the day of their birth. It's crazy. So in my opinion, that's a total recipe for integrity disaster. Still, there have been times when I've also encountered my favorite truth-speaking, keenly insightful comedians who stand on compassionate political platforms resorting to a level of meanness that has left me feeling kind of uncomfortable. When insightful and satiric commentary drops to a personal level of viciousness, when public figures and their partners and children and their appearance and personal inadequacies are just ripped apart for everybody to see, when their right to exist on the planet is seriously questioned, something just doesn't feel right. And it doesn't matter how humane the political platform of the comedian is or the important point that they're trying to make. Something about that whole situation just feels bad. It's like my integrity antennas go like, ick. These comedians are, of course, only showing us what we do in our own lives, right? They're just doing it on a much bigger scale on the screen in a way that allows us to have a laugh at other people's expense without actually feeling responsible, because we're not the ones saying the words. But what we're doing by laughing and by tuning into the show is we're giving our consent. We're joining the mean team. We're participating in a subtle form of cruelty that's not really good for our integrity health. And these comedians are holding up an integrity mirror for us. They're asking us to refine our taste and our ability to discern between the kind of truth-telling that changes the world for the better and wakes people up, and the kind that, even if it's hilarious, and it often is, just brings us all down, you know? The truth is that many of us who'd otherwise be funny in a gentler way get mean when we're feeling afraid, exhausted, exacerbated, desperate, and disillusioned. And there are so many reasons for all of us to be feeling that way, including today's hardworking comedians who can't even, take a 7-hour vacation without missing out on some seemingly essential and crazy-making piece of news in need for their commentary, right? If we're really wanting to develop our integrity muscles, it would behoove us to do a little check-in now and then and see how we're living up to our loving-kindness ideals. Sarah Silverman is one of my favorite comedians who I think has done a particularly good job of transcending the political and social divide and climate that's just currently spreading around the globe. So while her comedy often addresses social taboos and controversial topics like racism, sexism, politics, and religion, and she's about as irreverent as they come, she's gone out of her way to connect with all kinds of people, especially the people whose worldviews are very different from her own. She uses her humor and her understanding that people have more in common than we think, including the love of laughter, to break down defenses and open hearts. She understands that not everybody may agree on every social issue or who should be the leader of a country, but most people know what a bad case of diarrhea feels like. And in the end, most people know what it feels like to care about somebody deeply and how good it feels to be loved. So that brings me to my next point. Being honest about areas where we can improve doesn't give us the license to treat ourselves like crap. We don't have to be mean or cutting towards ourselves either. Being willing to pick up the piercing blade of love and truth may be necessary these days, but we need to be sure that we're not using that knife in order to cut off rejected pieces of ourselves and throw them in closets. I think the pressure to be politically or spiritually correct all of the time, which is different than what I was just talking about, which has more to do with an energetic, creates horrible internal conditions for people wanting to do, think, and say the right thing. The desire to think and speak perfectly can make self-honesty and inner inquiry impossible, which ultimately makes true, authentic dialogue impossible, which ultimately makes lasting relational and collective healing impossible. When we're beating ourselves up for not thinking and speaking perfectly, our capacity to listen energetically to other people with an open mind and an open heart also becomes harder and harder. We start to listen just for the words, right? Our minds are like totally consumed with assessing whether the words that are spoken are the right ones or the wrong ones, whether they're reflecting the right values or the wrong values. And as soon as we're in that state, our interactions with the people who are different from us can only result in diminishment, rejection, and exclusion. No matter how high our ideals, if we can't be ourselves, if people feel essentially unsafe being who they are in our presence, we can't transform this world into one where people are treated and honored with equal reverence. Right? We can only create new, increasingly specialized and differentiated versions of the same old crap. No one's integrity can discover itself and flourish in an environment riddled with division. True integrity understands at the core of cores, there is no separation within us or between us. Now, before I bring my reflections to an end, I want to acknowledge something that I've noticed in all of the people who I know well, who've spent their lives working within the fields of reconciliation, mediation, diversity awareness, and healing historic wounds. They're all very different people, but one quality they all share is an ability to hold a safe space for extremely honest conversations, where everybody is invited to put their worst thoughts, their worst fears and biases on the table, where ignorance is not judged as a horrible, unforgivable thing that needs to be just kind of nipped in the bud or put on trial or shoved in the closet or canceled. It's seen as a universal experience that all of us share. Our shared ignorance is our first common ground. When a group of people can begin a dialogue with that humbling realization, it can begin to practice real listening. So there you go. You got some of my personal thoughts on the wisdom keeper of equality and tenderness. Now let's invite you to explore some of your own.